From their beginnings, gardens have been places of beauty and bounty. Yet above all, they're the home of plants, places where we can watch and wonder at rhythms of life different from our own. Plants were about millions of years before us, and they've worked out a multitude of intricate, colourful and shapely solutions to the problems of living on the earth. Admiration, wonder, and then curiosity at the plant world came together over the centuries and led to the formation of our most famous botanic garden. It's easy to forget when you're surrounded by beautiful flowers that for all the world's technological achievements, we're still almost completely dependent upon plant products for much of the things that we do in our lives. Most of the world's diet, for instance, is still largely composed of fruit and vegetable and cereal products. We even managed to make some use of reeds and rushes, weaving them into bowls or, perhaps more lightheartedly, into hats. That much I think we do understand, but there's a hidden world of plant products as well, where we've managed to take a fragment from a particular species, a chemical or a seed or something, and turn it into something quite unrecognisable. We turn latex, for instance, into rubber. We managed to weave the hairy seeds of cotton into a remarkable fabric. Even something like 50% of the prescription drugs of the world are still based, at some point in their manufacture, on a plant product. Antibiotics, for instance, couldn't be made without the little fungi that live in the soil. Painkillers like codeine and morphine come from the opium poppy. And even the pill itself uses chemicals from a South American yam in part of its manufacture. Now, we've only explored the potentialities of about 4% of the world's 250,000 plant species, and I think you can imagine what we might discover if we had the chance to look at the others. And it's the business of great botanic gardens like Kew to make sure that we do have that chance. Kew is a sanctuary for plants, as well as a place to celebrate them and the way they sustain us, body and soul. Yet it's a place for investigation and research too. Behind the glorious arrays of colour, botanists work to help classify, utilise and conserve these extraordinary ornaments of the earth for the benefit of us all. It's an aspect of Kew not often seen by the visitor, but as much a part of its history as the pleasure gardens we all enjoy. For nearly 2 centuries, the Royal Botanic Gardens has collected together plants from all over the world, the unexpected, the strange, and the familiar. Yet in the time that this Chinese wisteria has been growing at Kew, the plant world itself has undergone dramatic changes. It's one of the ironies of this story that the exploitation of plants that Kew itself did so much to foster in the 19th century has reached such an intensity that it threatens whole areas of vegetation. These days, it's agriculture and forestry as much as the more traditional pressures of mineral extraction and development that have raised the rates of extinction to what some experts believe is something like 1 species a day. Well, you might well ask what a botanic garden has to do with the conservation of plants in the wild. But Kew has always seen plants as of central importance in human affairs. In Victorian times, the plant world was being opened up for the glorification of the British nation and the amusement of its people, with scarcely a thought that the basic resource might not be infinite. These days, the concern is more international, and conservation is the key word. But to understand how Kew has reached this position of what is really the centre of plant conservation, we have to look at its history. And that's a history which is actually laid out in the structure of the gardens. Not many flowers, but plenty of temples, groves, artfully contrived views, and even a pagoda. These were the ingredients of the original Kew, which by the mid-18th century comprised 2 royal gardens landscaped in fashionable period style. They were part of the Richmond estates of George II and were centred around 2 mansions, of which only the Dutch house, now known as Kew Palace, survives. In 1969, a garden was laid out next to the Dutch house in the fashion of early domestic gardens. These were more formal than we're used to today, with geometric beds edged with box and lavender, but they were also more functional. Most of the plants grown in them were medicinal or culinary herbs, or scented plants used to sweeten up rooms, wallflowers, mints, sweet campions and the like. Many of our favourite flowers began their careers in the Elizabethan gardens, being bought in for the most practical reasons, but staying on because people just grew affectionate for them. The little wild pansy, for instance, which is pretty enough not to have been changed at all from its wild form, was originally given for inflammation of the lungs. Some plants were adapted, though, so they became more attractive, but they still began with some sort of economic use. These pinks, for instance, which we now have in so many varieties and colours in our gardens, were once given for heart disorders. And this plant, which I think is one of the numerous species that claim the name bachelor's buttons, is feverfew, and it was brought here by the Romans as a kind of early aspirin to cure rheumatism and headaches. It may seem a far-fetched claim now, but recent research has suggested that it can be almost as good as some modern drugs for migraine and rheumatism. The old herbalists had a use for almost everything. Parkinson recommended the leaves and roots of muskmallows as an antidote to poisoning. And Gerard prescribed wild thyme for the wombling and griping of the belly. Though they may have been a bit unscientific, the Elizabethan herbalists laid the foundations of British botany. Their wonderful enjoyment of plants, which left us legacies like this sweet-smelling chamomile seat, and their sharp observation provided a base for the next generation of more scientific botanists to work from. During the late 1700s, scientists and travellers were exploring all the corners of the globe, and Kew was inundated with strange and exotic plants, many used in their homelands for food, medicine or clothing. Over 7,000 different species arrived in Britain during the reign of George III, and in 1772 he picked as the new head of the Royal Gardens young Joseph Banks, who had already sailed to the South Seas with Cook, and who had a vision of Kew becoming a focus for botanical exploration and research. It was one of Banks' protégés, Francis Masson, who brought back the celebrated bird of paradise flower from the Cape of Good Hope. It was pollinated by sunbirds and richly deserved its popular name. Its Latin name, Strelitzia reginae, is part of Kew's history and was coined in honour of George III's wife, Charlotte, Princess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Another of Masson's trophies from South Africa was a cycad, Encephalatus longifolius. The specimen he collected continues its laborious climb towards the farmhouse ceiling at a rate of 2 centimetres a year, and with over 200 years of residence behind it, it's now the oldest glasshouse plant at Kew. Collectors also found new roses, particularly in China, and it was the interbreeding of these long-flowering, tea-scented species with old European roses that gave rise to our richly blossomed floribundas. To these pioneering botanists, the whole world must have seemed like a bountiful garden laid out for their enchantment and delight. Masson alone, on his 3-year expedition to the Cape, discovered not just the bird of paradise flower, but 50 new pelargoniums and 85 new varieties of heather, some of which can still be seen round and about Kew. One collecting story involves a ship surgeon and some unidentified spiky leaves. At an official dinner in Chile, instead of eating all the nuts offered for dessert, he pocketed a few and sent them, germinating, back to Kew. The gardeners watched with some curiosity as they grew into what we now call a monkey puzzle tree. With Banks' death in 1820, Kew entered the 2 bleakest decades of its history. It had lost its guiding light and a good deal of its income besides. It was an odd moment for a decline because Britain had never been more excited about the wonders of natural creation, nor more aware of the need for green open spaces near the expanding cities. But all wasn't lost because a Royal Commission was set up to inquire into the garden's future. And in response to this mood of the time, it recommended that the garden should be open to the public. In that first year of opening in 1841, the price of admission was just 1 penny. And amazingly, it didn't rise from that until 1980. Now it's 10p.
Thank you very much.
But it's still just about the best 10p's entertainment you can get anywhere in Britain, I think. Within 5 years, the gardens had grown from 9 acres to 266, and the number of visitors coming to gaze at the wonders has risen from 9,000 in that first year to more than 1 million today. The man behind all this expansion was Sir William Hooker, who'd been appointed the first director of the Royal Gardens in 1840. Hooker was a man of enormous energy and talent. He not only ran the gardens, he edited botanical magazines and dispatched teams of botanists around the world to collect specimens and landscaped many of Kew's new acres. What he'd inherited from the previous Kew was not very great, but it was very precious, and it included this magnificent ginkgo tree, which had been planted in 1762. This was the first ginkgo, or maidenhair tree, to be grown in this country. Hooker also inherited a North American tulip tree, which he surrounded with a display of the brilliant azaleas that were being brought back from the United States. He was especially fond of ornamental shrubs and trees, and soon began to set them down all over the grounds. He planted oaks and pines, and a Chinese golden larch that in spring bursts into a wonderful array of freshly coloured shoots. It was the beginning of that ever-changing backcloth of green that makes Kew such a delight at every season. In fact, Hooker was just as enterprising a garden designer as he was a botanist, and his inspiration lies behind many of Kew's celebrated vistas. As Hooker was laying out his prospects, he had at the back of his mind a final triumphal flourish, the great glasshouse that was to be the culmination of his work at Kew. And suddenly, there it is, the Palm House, built in 1884 at a cost of £5,000. It was the largest, most elegant plant house in the world, and not the kind of place to flaunt its chimney. Its precocious design was more like an airship than a building. The welter of extraordinary plants brought here must have made the thousands of Victorian visitors gasp. There were trees from Madagascar and Malaya, giant ferns from Africa, orchids from Brazil, a whole world of magical, sinuous, extravagant growth. Yet it was seeing familiar commodities actually growing that was the most wonderful experience of all. Was this really coffee on a coffee bush? Could such a sour-looking pod contain the raw material of the chocolate that was becoming one of our favourite sweets? And where, southwest of London, might such an exotic creeping tendril lead? A marvel and a crop bunched into one. No wonder the nation's astonishment was mixed with pride at Kew's seeming mastery of the plant world. This great period of expansion at Kew in the middle of the 19th century occurs, of course, at the same time as the heyday of the British Empire. And it could be argued that the discovery and exploitation of the fabulous plant resources of Britain's new tropical colonies was the major economic factor underpinning imperial expansion. Kew played a central role in this, collecting plants like tea, sugar, cork oak, cinchona trees, and distributing them around the world for cultivation. It's not always a very happy story. There's as much destruction of vegetation and even of whole peoples involved as that sense of ingenuity and of the real central importance of plants. And there's no single species, I think, that tells these two faces of the economic botany of the 19th century better than the Brazilian rubber tree. The Brazilian Indians had always known about the latex that you could get if you cut into this bark of the tree. They used to pour it onto their feet to make a kind of waterproof shoe. It wasn't widely used until 1839, when Goodyear invented vulcanization. Then the rubber boom began, and whole forests of wild trees were devastated. To ensure rubber's economic future, it would have to be cultivated. The tree grew marvellously well in cultivation. The specimen at Kew has grown 30 feet in just 8 years, but there proved to be great problems in collecting and germinating the seeds. For a start, they wouldn't travel well, they tended to decay. And for a second, the Brazilian government was understandably rather reluctant to let out seeds of one of its most valuable plants. But in 1873, Joseph Hooker sent out a young man called Henry Wickham, and with the help of 2 huge strokes of luck, he was able to bring back fertile seeds to this country. The first was a fast, empty merchant ship he was able to commandeer. The second, the fact that he had a friend in the Brazilian customs. When the boat arrived at this country, a special freight train rushed the 70,000 seeds to Kew. They hadn't all survived the journey, but enough grew to provide more than 2,000 young trees. These were sent out to Ceylon, and they provided the backbone of the 10.5 million acres of rubber plantation that now grow in the Far East. The influence of Kew's rubber trees was far-reaching and long-lasting, but there's no doubt about which of its hothouse stars most excited the flower-mad Victorians. It was the giant South American water lily, Victoria amazonica, with leaves that could grow to a breadth of 6 feet in as many weeks, and which were strong enough to support a child. The leaf buds look like some freshwater urchin, but the flowers are quite beautiful and wonderfully punctual. On the first morning, they open white, but on the second day, they turn pink, then magenta, and at sunset sink, never to rise again. When Hooker came to Kew, he brought with him 60 gigantic boxes full of books and botanical specimens. It was the biggest collection in Europe, and in it were lots of the plant curios that Hooker and his friends had collected from around the world, from Indian arrow poisons to straw hats. And these went on to form the foundations of many of the great museums at Kew. But probably the most important thing he bought was his own herbarium. An herbarium is basically a collection of carefully preserved and meticulously labelled plant specimens. This, for instance, is the sheet which Hooker prepared himself for the cinchona tree, from which we eventually got quinine. This is a more familiar plant, the creeping buttercup from our own country, and this sheet was prepared by one of the students at Kew. And on it there are the precise identification of the plant, notes on exactly where and when it was collected, and on who did the collection. But the real important factor of an herbarium sheet is this combination of an actual piece of plant material and all this information, which, unlike an illustration, can never leave any doubt about which particular plant you're talking about. Over the last 2 centuries, the Kew Herbarium has built up a collection of 5 million of these specimens. They're the major source of reference for almost all the work in the Kew Gardens. One of the most intriguing recent cases of the use of the herbarium has been in connection with, of all things, some metal detection. And the evidence is contained in these sheets of a shrub from northern Rhodesia. It's a member of a family related to our bedstraws, and you may be able to see that the dry leaves, instead of fading to brown, are tinged with lemon. This is due to the presence of quite high concentrations of aluminium in the soil where these particular plants grew. So, since the herbarium sheets give precise references to where the specimens were gathered, scanning them has proved to be a useful first step in prospecting for aluminium deposits. Well, not much seems to fade away in herbarium specimens. I think the nicest story I know of the long-lasting influence of some of these very ancient plants is the one that concerns Linnaeus's nettle, which was put into an herbarium 200 years ago and then reclassified not so very long ago. And when this was done, it stung the person that was remounting it. William Hooker also started the Museum of Economic Botany with many of his own treasures. It now contains a vast collection of the useful bits and pieces of plants gathered from all over the world, but it still has a place for some homespun exhibits. The nettle specimens are particularly interesting because they're a fibre that was made from the stems, and I see they're dated 1943. They were part of the government's campaign during the Second World War to try and produce useful materials from our homegrown plants because of the blockade. There's more fibres down here from a family called the milkweeds, a kind of artificial cotton prepared from the stem here, a beautiful collar woven from it, but it was a very versatile family. Obviously, there's another species here called pleurisy root that I imagine was used medicinally. And here, most extraordinary of all, something that was used extensively in Java to poison tigers, which perhaps we might not like so much today. The third great reference source at the Botanic Gardens is the library, for which we must again thank Hooker. Like so much else at Kew, it's awesomely comprehensive, holding huge collections of paintings and photographs, as well as old books, new books, popular books, scientific papers from around the world, and the famous Index Kewensis, the continuing catalogue of the world's plants that was started with a bequest from Darwin. But the Botanical Magazine is the most venerable journal published at Kew, and it's been famous for its hand-coloured plates for nearly 200 years. It was founded by William Curtis in 1787 and moved to Kew under Hooker's editorship in the 1840s. Since then, it's maintained close links with Kew, and many of the illustrations are based on specimens from the garden. 750 copies are still printed twice a year, and with the total number of plates now topping 10,000, it's reckoned to be the richest single source of plant illustration in the world. Paintings are still regarded by most botanists as more helpful than photographs in capturing a plant's identifying characteristics, and Kew employs its own team of artists. Here, Haywoodiella oligocephala, a very scarce plant that only grows in the Canary Islands, is having its portrait painted for the magazine. The library also has a book on Himalayan plants by Joseph Hooker, William's son. It's one of many records of his early plant collecting expeditions before he became director of Kew in 1865. His journals, with their delightful illustrations, paint a vivid picture of the hazardous journeys he made in the Himalayas. He travelled in unexplored areas of Nepal, Tibet and Sikkim, making detailed maps of the region, many of which are still in use today. It needed 100 men to carry all the plants he collected, among which were no less than 28 new species of rhododendron. Hooker named his favourites after his friends and expedition companions. Their flowers were wonderfully eye-catching, and when their seeds were grown on at Kew, they caused a sensation in the gardening world, whose effects can still be seen the length and breadth of Britain. Kew's next development was partly prompted by the needs of these plants from the Far East that didn't always take kindly to our dull and chilly climate. This was the temperate house, and it wasn't the happiest of designs. Shade was a constant problem for the centre block because of its north-south alignment and the heavy shadow cast by the supporting walls. The side octagons had their share too, from soot deposited on the windows by the heating system. All in all, it was something of a white elephant, and in 1977, a complete reconstruction programme was started. This giant Chilean wine palm was one of the first plants raised in the original building, and is probably the biggest glasshouse plant in the world. Now, one of its seedlings is being set down to succeed it in the spacious new beds of the reconstructed temperate house. The new seedling is just 20 years old. Fully grown specimens in the wild can yield up to 90 gallons of sugary sap a year, and in Chile this is used to make palm honey. Ensuring that exotic trees will survive to reach maturity in the 21st century demands the kind of selfless care that small birds show to young cuckoos. No luxury is spared them in their new quarters. Roomy beds have replaced constricting pots, and there's light and air in abundance. After the 1890s, when the temperate house was built, there was a period of consolidation at Kew. Laboratories were set up, and courses started for students. The directors of many overseas botanical institutions were trained here. For the next 80 years, Kew went steadily about its ordinary business. It was important, absorbing work, but it lacked some of that sense of purpose of the garden's early years. But by the 1960s, changes were afoot in the world that were to jerk Kew back into action. A warning had been there all the time in the history of some of Kew's most treasured plants, the cycads. 150 million years ago, cycads had been one of the commonest plant families on the earth. Now only a few individuals survive. Kew's specimen of Encephalatos woodii is one of just a handful left alive in the world. Plant species are not immortal. Put them under enough stress and they can disappear forever. This mocked-up display of cacti from the North American deserts tells a whole saga of extinction and decline. Even the deserts themselves were often created by man by overgrazing or forest clearance. Now we're compounding the damage. Some American cacti, especially the large conspicuous varieties, have been pushed to the brink of extinction by the wholesale plundering of collectors. Collecting is just one of many threats, and deserts one of many threatened habitats. The richest plant communities of all are in the tropical rainforests, yet they're being destroyed at a terrifying rate. It's reckoned that an area about the size of Kew is vanishing every 3 minutes. It's even likely that plants are becoming extinct that we've never even seen, let alone learnt how to use. The loss to us in terms of plants that might have been good drug sources or food is incalculable. In the beginning of the 1970s, when we were becoming aware of the importance of conserving the natural environment, the director of Kew was Professor Heslop Harrison, and he realised the enormous contribution which the gardens could make to international botanical conservation. It had its living collections, it had its herbarium with its unique records of the distribution of plants in the past, and it had a team of botanists with international contacts and reputation. And so over the last decade, Kew has built itself up as a centre coordinating the international conservation of plants. And as one more contribution to that, it had in the meantime acquired yet another garden out in the country. Here was a garden twice the size of Kew, which could support many more common and threatened species, which needed clean, humid air and richer soil than could be found back at Kew. It was Wakehurst Place, opened to the public in 1965. It was deep in the Sussex Weald and already had a celebrated collection of Australian and North American species, and a pinetum. Rhododendrons abounded and put on a show that would have impressed even that connoisseur of these flowers, Joseph Hooker. Many of these plants, which have now become such a feature of our gardens, were discovered in the Far East at the beginning of this century by collectors such as Ernest Wilson. His most famous introduction to Britain was Davidia involucrata, the handkerchief or dove tree. He spent weeks in patient vigil under a tree in full flower, waiting for the seeds to set. And we also have Wilson to thank for this downward flowering magnolia. Yet in a botanic garden, only a very few specimens of each species are grown. So there's little of that genetic variety which can boost a species' chances of survival. Only in their natural habitat can we conserve wild plants successfully, with all their unpredictable characteristics. On the edge of the Wakehurst estate, there was an opportunity for the Royal Botanic Gardens to make a contribution to the conservation of British plants in the wild. It's now become the Loder Valley Reserve and contains a cross-section of the traditional habitats of the Weald: acid woodland, wet valleys and rocky gullies. It also contains some plants which are becoming increasingly rare in southeast England, notably the filmy fern, which lies hidden away under the darkest, dampest rocks. It only survives in a few ancient undisturbed woodlands, and being just one cell thick, is vulnerable in very many ways. But when a plant's natural habitat is under threat, it may be possible to preserve some of the genetic diversity in a seed bank. Here at Wakehurst, in a refrigerator kept at -20 degrees, millions of dried seeds are stored for the future. A file can contain 10,000 seeds of one species. It's a wide-ranging international collection, and the seeds can survive storage for a varying number of years. Lettuce for 11, rice for maybe 300. The fruits of one Kenyan expedition include Sodom's apple, used locally to treat indigestion, warts and sheep coughs. Some valuable seeds don't store well. Acorns, for example, may not survive to germinate beyond a year. Whereas wild peas and beans actually need to have their seed coats artificially broken before they'll germinate. Some alpine seeds need chilling, others need heat, and research goes on into how the rigours of a plant's wild environment can be duplicated in the laboratory. A few seeds from each batch are normally grown on, firstly to check viability over the years of storage, and secondly to verify the identification of the plant. If it's to be of any use, it must be accurately named, so a dried and mounted sample of every plant stored as a seed is sent to the Herbarium at Kew. Requests for seeds for horticultural, agricultural and medical research come from round the world. Brussels University wanted quantities of the vetch Vicia villosa to use in their research into tumour suppression. So Wakehurst planted out 200 seeds and was able to harvest tens of thousands. Rare plants are also nurtured for their seeds at Kew. Some orchids have been almost exterminated in the wild and may be represented by just a single specimen in botanic gardens. So to guarantee future stocks, a kind of botanical AID is carried out. The male pollinia is placed on the female stigma and the plant nurtured until it sets seed. The resulting seed pod may produce as many as 1 million seeds. The seeds are parcelled up and sterilised to destroy fungi and bacteria. Each envelope may contain 100 seeds. It's a technique known as micropropagation. Light, humidity, temperature are all controlled to give the seeds the best possible chance to germinate. They even have a specially prepared growing medium to give them a start in life. A few months later, or maybe a few years, the intensive care results in a riot of colour. The conservation of wild habitats is more of a problem, as we've seen, but Kew's own garden habitats are in good hands, and when those fledgling plants emerge out of the laboratory, they'll join the others already in the care of Kew's gardeners. They're a team of some 200 who certainly deserve a portrait for posterity.
Right, now this one's in colour. Right. Right, please. Thank you.
Caring for a great botanic garden is, of course, not so different from tending an ordinary garden. Both need their fair share of digging and pruning and sheer hard graft. The students on their 3-year course learn their trade from those more experienced and will go on to carry Kew's very special character all over the world. It's probably no coincidence that Kew has prospered in a nation where gardening is the favourite leisure activity. Without the enterprise of all those nameless gardeners who first discovered how to grow this plant and that in unfamiliar soil, botanic gardens would be poorer places. But it's a two-way relationship, and we, for our part, can find inspiration from Kew and see perhaps where our own garden plants fit into the great botanical scheme of things. There are many of those increasingly popular plants, the alpines, in the outdoor beds. Thrift tolerates our damp climate well. So do many potentillas. But even more alpines survive because of this gadget in the garden, a super glasshouse. It's surrounded by a moat of fresh water that not only sustains the plants within, but moistens the air as it passes over. Detecting a change in the weather, this glasshouse, like a sensitive flower, takes care of itself by opening and closing automatically. The central cold bench is refrigerated and especially lit. Other beds recreate a bog, a mountain stream, or a desert for an iris. The needs of every flower are catered for, and the display changes continually with the seasons. Over 2,000 flowers bloom here, and many may never have been seen before in cultivation. With something like 40,000 species at Kew, accurate naming is essential. Every specimen is well labelled, and once its identity has been verified by the herbarium, it's given a number. No plant, however small, can be forgotten. Its biography is card indexed, detailing its collector, where and when it was found, and much more besides. With over 100,000 individual plants at Kew, it's not surprising that this information is now computerised. But there's more to a plant than just a pretty flower, and that takes us to the laboratories. Plants can be identified not only by their appearance, size, colour, etc., but by their internal structures, a particular cell pattern in the leaf or root. So it's possible to identify plant products such as furniture, drugs and poisons. The divers working on the Mary Rose, Henry VIII's sunken ship, sent 2 arrows to Kew The ancient shafts, still amazingly preserved, proved to be made of poplar, and the leather round them bound with silk. This charcoal, found during the excavation of an Iron Age site, contains clues to the nature of the forest that grew 2,000 years ago in East Sussex. Careful scrutiny of the cell structure under a microscope reveals a wide range of species: oak, birch, beech and hazel. This remnant of an Egyptian sieve of the 1st century BC from Kew's museum collection has a frame made of date palm and a papyrus binding which is very distinctive. These 56 pieces of driftwood were all washed up on the island of Aldabra and have revealed a great deal about the circulation of Indian Ocean currents. During the drought of 1976, tree roots arrived in their thousands for examination. Each root was accused of causing a house to subside by sucking all the water from the clay beneath. It was vital to check whose tree the root belonged to, as each dot on the map was a call of desperation from a house owner planning to make an insurance claim against his, or with luck, his neighbour's guilty tree. Many other valuable fields of research are pursued here, including the chemical analysis of plants. It's long been known that foxglove produces a heart stimulant, deadly nightshade a sedative, and the opium poppy a narcotic. Any plant, when analysed, could contain a substance useful as a medicine or insecticide, or maybe a resin or new food product. So botanic gardens have a dramatic new role to play as holding grounds for the stocks of these potentially valuable plants. Kew was one of the first gardens to recognise this, and it led to the formation of a body designed to help botanic gardens round the world make a concerted attempt to conserve endangered plants. But general advice wasn't their only concern. One of the other productions of the Threatened Plants Committee is the Plant Red Data Book, which is a collection of case histories of 250 threatened plants. And remember, that's just 1 in 100 of all the species in danger in the world. It gives their distribution, their current numbers, threats, conservation measures which have been taken and need to be taken. The plant on the cover is a very appropriate one. It's Lotus bertolottii, a beautiful member of the pea family from the Canaries. It's almost extinct there now as a result of collection, and it hasn't much chance of re-establishing itself naturally because it depends for pollination on a bird, which has also become extinct. The Canary Island flowers, of which there's a wonderful collection in their own house at Kew, are under rather special stresses because of the island's history and climate. Take this Echium wildpretii, for example, a relative of our Viper's bugloss. It grows to an immense height on the side of just a single crater and is under threat from collectors. It's just one of 500 species which grow nowhere else in the world besides the Canary Isles. Isolation from the mainland and the immense variety of habitats, from deserts to damp mountains, has helped this flora develop its own unique identity. Although they look familiar, these plants are scarce and vulnerable, and among the first to come under threat. This is where the Threatened Plants Committee can help in encouraging the creation of nature reserves and ensuring that botanic gardens preserve plants like this dragon's blood tree, named for the dark red gum it exudes from its trunk, which is supposed to have magical and medicinal properties. This particular tree has a long ancestry and began its life some 20 years ago as a cutting from a specimen in the Temperate House, which itself originated from a tree in Tenerife struck down by lightning in 1869. So much information has now been gathered on so many plants that it's recently become essential to store it on a computer and to provide access for as many people as possible. It's a friendly, neighbourhood sort of computer from which any one of us might get vital information on an endangered plant. The point about endangered plants is that, as well as being important in their own right, they're very vivid indicators of the degradation that's happening to our natural environment. So let's hope that all this information that's being gathered together at Kew may help people and governments around the world take some action to turn this tide. Open day at Kew, a chance for the staff to relax and show off the fruits of their labours to thousands of visitors of all ages from all over the world. Even when it isn't too easy to understand, the hidden life of plants is always a source of fascination.
I can't. Put those. Put one eye here and one eye there. That's it. There, what can you see through there?
Even the most obscure research has its uses. It's typical of Kew that a project on the tissue culture of orchids led to the mass production of the plant for a large department store. Taking the message of plants to the people, and particularly to the young, is now seen as the most urgent task in conservation.
Now from here we can see a nice range of different sorts of grasses. Grasses for making lawns, grasses for football pitches, and then over there, what is that one? Does anybody know what that is? What the American people call corn, and we in England call it maize or corn on the cob. So let's go and have a look at that, shall we?
These children are learning that most basic biological lesson, that variety in the plant world is what keeps it and us alive. Plants have something for every one of us, and so, through its magnificent celebration of them, does Kew. It's a place for quiet contemplation and active recording. A place for those who want to remember, and for those who know nothing yet about endangered ecosystems, but a good deal about long green days in the sun. If there is a single message in such a rich and complex place, it might be this: we depend upon plants for our survival, yet we've plundered whole areas of the world's vegetation and explored and made use of only a fraction of its individual plants. There's not much time left for us to put these mistakes right. The history of our relationship with the plant world is vividly told in the gardens, and Kew's long experience and rich collections could make a vital contribution to how it develops in the future. But ultimately, the future depends on us, and whether we can learn to live in harmony with the plants that, in all their wonderful diversity, have spread across the world using nothing more expensive than sunlight.
Another work by Mozart, the Piano Concerto No. 17 in G, is featured in Radio 3's lunchtime concert.